Welcome to Radio Who, What, Why. I'm Jeff Schechtman. While politicians often talk of those things that unite us as Americans, there are equally powerful forces that divide us. Not always the political forces, but at the center is often the taboo subject of class. Even more than race, the class divide lies at the base of the chasm that separates what was once called two Americas. The symbols are everywhere: Starbucks America versus Dunkin' Donuts America, educated versus non-educated, Walmart versus Whole Foods, etc. But these symbols are but the latest manifestations of a 400-year history of class conflict in America. That's the story that Nancy Isenberg talks to me about as she tells me more about her look at the 400-year history of white trash in America. It is my pleasure to welcome Nancy Isenberg to Radio Who, What, Why. Nancy, thanks so much for joining us.
Well, thanks for having me.
Why has this as a subject in general been taboo so often for so long in American history?
Well, part of what I highlight is the way in which certain myths get invented. In particular, the one that has a lot of power is the idea that at the time of the American Revolution, we broke free from the British class system. And this is a myth that we usually associate with figures such as Thomas Jefferson and his words from the Declaration of Independence. But the problem with that is that the evidence is contrary to that notion, because Jefferson, just like Benjamin Franklin and most of the founders, grew up in a society based on English ideas. So the idea of class, the idea of poverty, lingered on and proved to be quite forceful in defining the way in which Americans thought about class. Particularly what I highlight in this book is the role of rural poverty and the way in which class standing was connected to land ownership and property.
To what extent is so much of this something that is inherent in us as human beings, and that is that tribal instinct, that desire to associate with people like ourselves?
Well, it's really interesting. I mean, it's funny that you say that, because that is actually an interesting issue that I address in a debate between John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. This was a series of letters that they exchanged in 1813. And Adams basically made that argument. He said that, Americans were ambitious. They wanted to separate themselves and, reestablish class differences. And he went on to argue that, if you threw 40 men in a room, that they would quickly divide themselves into different factions, and that somebody, one group would try to get more power than the other group. So the idea of emphasizing differences, the idea that the class system polices the boundaries so that we can tell the stark differences between the middle class and the lower class, is a part of the way societies organize. So I wouldn't say it's instinctual, even though someone like John Adams might believe it is. I think it's reinforced by the way in which social orders are created.
Is it also reinforced by the very nature of democracy and electoral politics, even going back to the founders, in that it then becomes something that can be exploited? I mean, we're seeing the modern manifestation of that today.
Yeah, I think this is always the unpleasant side of democracy, is that if we go back to someone like Andrew Jackson, who was promoted as a common man, he came from Tennessee. I say how he was associated with the Southern backcountry. He's given the name Old Hickory. He didn't come from necessarily an upper-class background. He wasn't as well educated as his rival, John Quincy Adams. But by the time he's running for president, he's very wealthy. He's a slave owner. We have this problem in democracy, and it really starts in this period, that we expect our politicians to be like us. We expect them to at least perform in a way that makes them seem as if they're ordinary people. And this is, I highlight an Australian observer who made this comment in 1949. He said that we don't have a democracy. We accept huge disparities of wealth. What we have is a democracy of manners. And we go through these rituals. I mean, the one that always bothers me, since I actually live in Iowa, is the idea of, every candidate goes to Iowa, puts on their plaid shirt, eats their corn dogs, and suddenly they're not the wealthy politicians that they are.
To what extent have demographics and geography played a role in this? You talked about rural poverty before, but it does seem that the class divide, as it's moved around, as it's shifted in American history, has always in some way reflected the movement of the population at times from rural to urban and urban to rural, etc., that's been a big part of it.
Yeah, it's very important. Class has a geography. One of the things that I highlight is that the reason that Ben Franklin thought that America would create a different class system was through Western migration. The size of the continent would flatten out the class system, get rid of the extremes of wealth and poverty, and establish a happy mediocrity. The problem with that, it didn't happen, because as people moved west, so did the wealthy large land speculators, the wealthy landholders. So class systems are reproduced as people move west. But the rural-urban divide is another really important one. I mean, by the beginning of the 20th century, there's a lot of emphasis on arguing that people who leave the countryside, who left rural society, left their small town, basically were the better people, the smarter people, the more ambitious people, where the people who are not, the people who are left behind, are the ones who stay in poverty. So we do have this kind of long-standing bias between rural America and urban America. And we also have this myth, I mean, this is true of Franklin and Jefferson, that they didn't promise upward mobility. What they promised was horizontal mobility. So class is about migration. And that is a really important feature in American history.
It also reflects, I mean, what you were just talking about with respect to rural and urban, reflects the immigrant experience, that it becomes a self-selecting population of those that can make the journey to come to America. And it's the same thing, again, this issue of migration.
Right, and I think one of the problems we have with immigrants, we have to realize when people come to this country, some come from very wealthy backgrounds. They're not in the same position, even when they get off the boat, with poor immigrants. So we want to often, and this is true with the pioneer myth as well, we think migration, like Franklin said, is somehow puts us on an equal plane, but it really doesn't. I mean, if you come over in steerage, you're in a different class position than people who have their own cabins on the ship. So I think that's another theme where we know, yes, there are examples of social mobility. It's not as if I'm denying it, but not on the scale that we would imagine.
Has the racial divide, or did the racial divide for so long in America kind of cover up, paper over this issue of the class divide? And as we have attempted to deal with racial issues, arguably somewhat more effectively in modern times, it has brought the class issue into greater bold relief.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I mean, I argue from the very beginning, race and class are intertwined. Because from the beginning, if you think about the colonial period, the majority of people would fall into the category of being unfree, and that would be slaves, convict labor, indentured servants, and we forget the fact that slavery, even in the colonial period, people were quite aware, and this is something Franklin and Jefferson were aware of, that slavery as a system created a planter hierarchy, and it disadvantaged poor yeoman farmers. This is something that James Oglethorpe argued when he was trying to establish Georgia and prohibited slavery in its early years from being instituted in Georgia. So yes, from the very beginning, we see this contest between slave labor and free white labor, and you're exactly right. This ends up being an issue in the rise of the Confederacy, and then it becomes used again by what are known as the redneck politicians of the early 20th century, like James Vardaman, who exploit, racial and, class divisions in order to keep people, focus on people who are poor and helpless and have them direct their hatred there rather than realizing who has power in society. To divert from attacking the elite, it's much easier to see someone of your own class as a rival, whether it's a political rival or whether it's a rival in terms of, trying to survive in a really difficult economic system.
What impact has mass culture, as it has ultimately resulted in television and mass media, but the idea of mass culture, what impact has that had on the class divide?
Well, it's really interesting. One of my favorite historians that I studied with as an undergraduate, Warren Sussman, argued about the introduction of radio and how important it was that finally you had a national culture. People began singing the same songs, hearing the same advertisements. So there's a way in which mass media does give people common reference points. But I think at the same time, when we try to think about mass media, particularly TV, we know even to this day that TV shows are marketed for high population areas or pitching shows that really appeal to the middle class because TV, like radio, is made to sell things. So a lot of what's on TV you can measure by what they're advertising. So we don't have necessarily a TV, a selection of shows that actually encompass the full diversity of the United States.
Well, it's interesting that we, to some extent, we did in the early days of radio and even particularly in the early days of television before it became more atomized in so many ways, and certainly the internet and the long tail has carried that even a step further.
Right. No, and I talk about the importance, this is what's so remarkable, the importance of television. I talk about the importance of the Beverly Hillbillies. Again, reviving that sort of negative portrait of, the hillbilly poor. If you remember that show, essentially the hillbillies, even though they're wealthy, even though they move to Hollywood, they sort of adopt none of the mannerisms, the etiquette, all the things we associate with upward mobility. The whole system in the United States is that if you are going to rise up, suddenly you begin talking like the middle class, dressing like the middle class, and adopting their values. And that theme has clearly been revived with reality TV as well.
Talk about the history of class conflict. We know pretty much the highlights and lowlights of racial conflict in America. To what extent has class conflict played itself out?
White trash are kind of a window in the class system, and how class moves to the center of key political debates, whether it's Western migration, it's the Civil War, the sectional controversy, Reconstruction. Reconstruction is the perfect example of the contest between free blacks and poor whites. Essentially, Union soldiers, agents who worked for the Freedmen's Bureau said over and over again that if the South was going to be rebuilt, it was going to be a contest about who rose more quickly. Is it going to be free blacks or is it going to be poor whites? And many of them felt that free blacks were making progress at a much faster rate in terms of getting jobs and educating their children. So this is, my focus is really talking about the importance of how white trash becomes politicized when it moves to the center of the debate. And when I talk about class differences, one of the periods that we often forget are the 1920s and the rise of eugenics, where essentially prominent eugenicists begin to argue that we want an elite class, a cognitive class, and they even came up with a word for it, aristogenic. And at the same time, they're arguing for this idea that poor whites should not be able to have children, and you get the widespread passage of sterilization laws. By 1931, 27 states have sterilization laws in the books. So there again, you see how class is connected to intellect. The IQ testing that was first introduced in the 1910s was all measured by class. The idea that class standing would determine the intellect of the next generation. So those are the themes that I try to highlight when I talk about class conflict, or the way in which white trash are used over and over again as a way to justify that we will always have the poor, and nothing you can do, whether you give them charity, is going to actually help them to be integrated into normal society.
What impact did universal education have on this debate, this divide?
Well, education is really interesting. This is the other thing we forget, is we know in New England, even in the 19th century, They had much more widespread public education. We go south, we see that they didn't, because they didn't want to pay for it. And this is one of the problems when we think about illiteracy. The problems of illiteracy, not only were they greater in the South, but they were greater in rural areas. So that by the time of World War I, we begin to see studies being done showing that the prevalence and persistence of illiteracy in rural and particularly southern areas. So that gets to a contemporary issue today. What are we willing to pay for to help society? And education has always been a controversial issue.
Where are we then, as you look at this history? Where are we today on this continuum? Are we near an apogee? Or how do we fit in today when you look at this class divide playing itself out today, particularly as we see this migration again towards urban areas?
We've had periods where we have created a pseudo-aristocracy, to use Jefferson's term. We've had the Gilded Age with the Rockefellers. So in no way is this not an issue, that the way our tax structure works, that we have helped facilitate the growth of the 1%. But what's also important that I think is really interesting is that we think of the 1% as people who are connected to Wall Street and finance. But in fact, it's not a surprise that Donald Trump, a real estate mogul, is running for president, because the 1% also own the majority of land in this country. So we haven't even escaped that inequality in the distribution of land. And I think this is something that journalists talk about all the time, the increasing disparity between the wealthy and the poor. But what I'm trying to say is this is not a new thing, because journalists always imagine this is like brand new. We've never had this before, but we have.
Nancy Isenberg. Nancy, I thank you so much for spending time with us today.
Well, thank you for having me.
Thank you. Thank you for listening and joining us here on Radio Who, What, Why. I hope you join us next week for another Radio Who, What, Why podcast. I'm Jeff Sheckman. If you like this podcast, please feel free to share and help others find it by rating and reviewing it on iTunes. You can also support this podcast and all the work we do by going to whowhatwhy.org/donate.